The chandelier above the Blackwood dining table blurred into 3 shimmering orbs, then 6. Clara Miller gripped the edge of her dinner plate, porcelain cold beneath fingers that had lost all feeling an hour ago. The metallic taste in her mouth had become constant now, like sucking on old pennies. Around the table, 18 members of the Duke's family continued their conversation about pheasant hunting and the sorry state of the railways, their voices reaching her as if from underwater. She tried to lift her wine glass. Her hand trembled so violently the burgundy liquid sloshed against the crystal rim. Before we continue, if this story has already drawn you in, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It allows these quiet Victorian tales to reach others who value depth and timeless storytelling. And if you're willing, do leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. Really, Clara? Silas Vane's voice cut through the fog in her mind, sharp as winter frost. The Duke of Blackwood sat at the head of the table in his impeccable evening dress, his aristocratic face arranged in that expression she'd come to know too well, boredom laced with contempt. Must you make a spectacle at every meal? Your American theatrics are becoming tiresome. She wanted to tell him that her vision was failing, that her heart was racing so fast she could hear it pounding in her ears, that the tremors in her limbs had grown worse each day this week. Instead, she managed only a whisper. "Silas, Enough." He didn't even look at her as he cut into his venison. "If you cannot maintain proper decorum, retire to your chambers. I'm certain you'll recover once you have an audience that appreciates your performances." Clara tried to stand. Her legs wouldn't obey. The faces around the table swam in her vision, the Dowager Countess with her perpetual sneer, Cousin Edmund watching with those calculating eyes, Mrs. Pemberton the housekeeper whose mouth was set in a thin line of disapproval. They all thought the same thing. The Dollar Princess bought her way into Blackwood with American Railroad money, and now she's desperate for attention the Duke won't give. The room tilted sideways. Clara felt herself falling, watched her hand reach out for something to catch herself on, finding only empty air. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was the crash of breaking china and Silas's voice, annoyed rather than alarmed. For God's sake, someone help her to her room. She's determined to ruin the entire evening. Then nothing. Clara regained consciousness in fragments. The velvet settee in the drawing room beneath her cheek. The acrid smell of smelling salts. Voices arguing in the corridor outside, one she didn't recognize. "Damned stubborn fool, Silas. Look at her. She's been collapsing for weeks, Thomas. Each time I call you, and each time you tell me there's nothing wrong. Forgive me if I've grown skeptical of my wife's mysterious ailments. This is different. Is it? Or has she simply refined her technique?" Clara's eyes fluttered open. The drawing room came into focus, all dark paneling and heavy velvet drapes that seemed designed to keep out joy along with sunlight. Blackwood Manor had felt like a mausoleum from the moment she'd arrived as a bride 6 months ago, but tonight it felt like a tomb. Her tomb. The door opened. Silas entered first, his posture rigid, his handsome face a mask of barely controlled irritation. Behind him came a man she'd met only once, at their wedding, Dr. Thomas Sterling, the Duke's closest friend from university. Where Silas was all sharp angles and cold formality, Thomas had the steady, watchful presence of someone who saw too much and said too little. "You're awake." Silas remained by the door, as if proximity to her might be contagious. Dr. Sterling has insisted on examining you. Again. I trust you'll cooperate so we can end this circus. Thomas moved to her side, his medical bag already open, his expression professional but not unkind. Mrs. Vane, Clara, I need you to tell me everything you're experiencing. Every symptom, no matter how small. She tried to focus, to put words to the constellation of miseries that had been growing for weeks. The tremors. The metallic taste. The episodes where her vision would narrow to a pinpoint. The way her stomach rejected nearly everything she ate. The hair she'd found on her pillow this morning, coming out in handfuls. I feel like I'm dying, she whispered. Silas made a sound of disgust. Melodrama runs in your blood, doesn't it? Thomas didn't even glance at him. His fingers were cool and professional as he checked her pulse, tilted her head to examine her eyes, asked her to follow his finger with her gaze. When he pressed gently on her abdomen, she gasped in pain. Your Grace, Thomas said quietly, still focused on Clara, I need to speak with you. Privately. Now. Thomas, really? Now, Silas. Something in the doctor's voice made even the Duke obey. Clara watched through her haze as the two men stepped into the corridor. The door didn't close completely. Through the gap, she could see Silas's profile, still skeptical, still convinced this was all performance. Then Thomas leaned close and whispered something Clara couldn't hear. She saw the exact moment the words registered. Silas's face went white. His hand shot out to brace against the wall. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its aristocratic certainty. What? Thomas's response was louder now, urgent. She isn't pretending, Silas. Someone is killing her. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara lay on the settee, her broken body finally validated, and watched her husband's carefully constructed world of cynicism and contempt begin to crumble. Outside the windows of Blackwood Manor, fog rolled in from the moors like something alive, wrapping the estate in gothic gloom. Inside, the real darkness had already taken root. And now, finally, someone believed her. The morning after her collapse at dinner, Clara insisted on taking her daily walk. The household physician, a doddering old man who'd served the Vanes for 40 years, had pronounced her suffering from feminine hysteria and prescribed rest and laudanum. Silas had accepted this diagnosis with visible relief, as if it confirmed everything he believed about his dramatic American wife. But Clara refused to be confined to her chambers like some invalid. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her weak. So she wrapped herself in her heaviest cloak and stepped into the winter gardens, determined to prove she was stronger than they thought. The snow had fallen overnight, transforming Blackwood's grounds into something almost beautiful. Almost. The bare tree still looked like skeletal fingers clawing at the grey sky, and the maze of hedges seemed designed to trap rather than delight. Clara made it as far as the frozen fountain before the trembling started again. Not now. Please, not now. She gripped the stone edge of the fountain, her breath coming in short gasps. The metallic taste flooded her mouth again, stronger than ever. Her vision began to narrow, the white landscape closing in like the walls of a tunnel. She tried to take a step back toward the house, but her legs had turned to water. The snow was soft when she hit it. Almost welcoming. Clara lay there watching the clouds drift past, thinking absurdly of the snowmen she used to build with her brothers in Boston. How far away that life seemed now. How impossibly far. She didn't know how long she'd been there when she heard boots crunching through the snow. Silas's voice, sharp with annoyance rather than concern. "Clara! Get up! This is ridiculous." She couldn't answer. Couldn't move. The cold had stopped hurting now, which some distant part of her mind recognized as a very bad sign. "I said get up. Closer now." Then silence. Then, with something that might have been uncertainty creeping into his voice, "Clara." He knelt beside her, and for the first time since their wedding night, Silas Vane touched his wife with something other than perfunctory courtesy. His hand on her face was warm, almost burning against her frozen skin. He pulled off his glove, pressed his fingers to her throat searching for a pulse. "Christ!" The word was barely audible. He gathered her into his arms, her dead weight seeming to surprise him. Had she really become this light? "Clara! Clara, can you hear me?" She wanted to tell him this wasn't an act, that she'd been telling the truth all along, that she was terrified and in pain and desperately wanted to go home to America where people believed her when she said something was wrong. But the darkness was pulling her down again, gentle and insistent. Silas was running now, carrying her across the snow-covered lawn toward the house, shouting for the servants. She felt the jarring of each step, heard the panic finally breaking through his aristocratic composure. "Someone fetch Dr. Sterling. Now. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him," his voice cracked. "Tell him I think my wife is dying." The last thing Clara remembered before consciousness slipped away entirely was the feeling of Silas's heart pounding against her cheek, racing just as fast as her own. For the first time since she'd arrived at Blackwood Manor, the Duke seemed genuinely afraid. Not of scandal or embarrassment, but of loss. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it just felt like goodbye. Clara woke to the sound of two men arguing in whispers. The bedroom was dark except for firelight, and her body felt like it was made of lead. Every breath took effort. Every heartbeat hurt. Absolutely certain. Silas's voice, stripped of its usual arrogance. "Look at the evidence, man." Thomas sounded exhausted. The tremors, the metallic taste, the gastrointestinal distress, the hair loss, the hyperpigmentation on her skin. "I've seen this before, in a case study from Vienna. Small doses over time, meant to mimic natural illness. But why? Who would? That's not my concern right now. Keeping her alive is." A pause. "Silas, she's been consuming poison for weeks, possibly months. The damage to her system is extensive. If we don't neutralize the toxin and stop further exposure immediately, she won't survive the week." Clara tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids were too heavy. She lay there listening to her husband learn that his cruelty had provided perfect cover for murder. "What do you need?" Silas asked. "First, we need to identify the source. It's being administered regularly, which means it's in something she consumes daily. Food, drink, medicine." Thomas's footsteps moved closer to the bed. "Second, we cannot let anyone know we've discovered it. Whoever is doing this will either flee or accelerate their timeline if they suspect we know. You're asking me to pretend nothing's wrong while my wife is being murdered. I'm asking you to be smart. We continue as normal. You maintain your skeptical facade. I treat her for hysteria publicly while administering the actual antidote in private. We watch everyone in this household like hawks and wait for the poisoner to make a mistake. And if they don't make a mistake, then we set a trap. Thomas's voice hardened. But Silas, this means you have to sell the performance of your life. You have to act like you still don't believe her, like you still think she's being dramatic. Can you do that? The silence stretched long enough that Clara wondered if Silas had left the room. Then, quietly, I've been doing it for 6 months. What's a few more days? Good. Now let me work. And Silas? Thomas's voice softened. When this is over, you're going to have to reckon with what your contempt nearly cost you. But first, we keep her alive. Clara heard Silas move to the far side of the room, heard him sink into a chair. For a long time, there was only the sound of Thomas working, mixing compounds, checking her vital signs with professional efficiency. Then Silas spoke again, so quietly she almost missed it. I should have believed her. Thomas didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They both knew the truth now. Clara had been screaming for help while drowning, and the man who'd vowed to protect her had stood on the shore calling her a liar. The arsenic hadn't killed her yet, but Silas's pride had come close enough. Clara felt Thomas's cool hand on her forehead, heard him murmur something about fever and toxicity levels. She wanted to tell him she forgave them both, that she understood, that she just wanted to live. But the darkness was rising again, pulling her under like a tide. As she slipped back into unconsciousness, she heard Silas's voice one more time, cracked and raw with something that might have been grief. Don't let her die, Thomas. Please. I can't, I won't survive it. Too late, Clara thought. Too late to care now. But some stubborn part of her, the part that had survived a loveless marriage and 6 months of isolation and weeks of systematic poisoning, held on to those words anyway. Held on to them like a lifeline in the dark. Silas Vane sat in his study nursing a brandy he had no intention of drinking, watching the fire burn low in the grate. 3 o'clock in the morning. The hour when all the carefully constructed lies fell away and a man was left alone with his conscience. He'd been reviewing the past 6 months with the meticulous attention he usually reserved for estate accounts, and the tally was damning. Every time Clara had complained of illness, he dismissed it as attention-seeking. Every time she'd grown paler, thinner, more fragile, he'd attributed it to her American constitution being too delicate for English winters. Every tremor, every fainting spell, every plea for help, he'd turned them all into evidence of her fundamental weakness, her manipulation, her desperate need for the affection he refused to give. And all the while, someone had been killing her. Slowly. Methodically. Right under his nose. The worst part was understanding why the murderer had chosen this method. They'd counted on his cruelty. They'd weaponized his contempt. Every dose of arsenic had been administered with the certainty that the Duke of Blackwood would do exactly what he'd done, dismiss his wife's suffering as theatre. He thought of Clara in the snow that morning, so light in his arms she might have been made of paper. He thought of the fear in Thomas's eyes when he'd examined her, the careful way he'd explained that another week of exposure would have been fatal. He thought of his wife lying 3 doors down, fighting for her life while he'd spent months telling her she was lying. Silas had married Clara for her money. He'd needed her fortune to save Blackwood from his father's catastrophic debts, and she'd needed a title to satisfy her mother's social ambitions. It had been a transaction, nothing more. He told himself he was being honest by refusing to pretend otherwise, by maintaining cold distance rather than offering false affection. But honesty without kindness was just cruelty with better manners. And his cruelty had nearly gotten her killed. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the manor, a clock chimed the quarter hour. Silas finished his brandy in one swallow and stood. He couldn't change the past 6 months. Couldn't undo the damage his contempt had done. But he could damn well make sure Clara survived long enough for him to beg her forgiveness. And he could make sure whoever had tried to murder his wife would pay for it with everything they had. Thomas had been right. They needed to maintain the facade, to let the household believe nothing had changed. Starting tomorrow, Silas would have to walk past Clara's sick room with indifference. Would have to dismiss her hysteria in front of the servants. Would have to play the part of the skeptical husband while secretly working to save her life. It should have been impossible. But Silas had spent 6 months perfecting the role of the cold, indifferent duke. Now he would use that mask as a weapon. He moved to his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. If he was going to catch a murderer, he needed to think like one. Who stood to gain from Clara's death? The estate was entailed, her fortune had already been transferred to his control before the wedding. Her death would bring him no financial benefit, which meant this was personal. Someone who resented her. Someone who wanted her gone. Silas began to write. Cousin Edmund, who'd expected to inherit before Silas's sudden marriage. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who'd served the family for 30 years and made no secret of her contempt for the American interloper. The Dowager Countess, his father's sister, who'd called Clara a dollar princess to her face at the wedding breakfast. 3 suspects. Any one of them could have poisoned her tonics, her tea, her meals. Any one of them had motive and opportunity. By the time dawn broke over Blackwood's grounds, Silas had a plan. A dangerous one, perhaps. But danger was preferable to the alternative. He would not lose his wife. Not to poison. Not to pride. Not to anything. Even if saving her meant finally admitting he'd been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Clara woke to candlelight and the sensation that her body had been hollowed out and filled with sand. Everything hurt in a distant, muffled way, as if the pain was happening to someone else and she was merely observing it. She tried to move and managed only to turn her head slightly on the pillow. Silas sat in a chair beside her bed, still dressed in his evening clothes from what might have been yesterday or last week. Time had lost all meaning. His face was drawn, shadows under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. When he realized she was awake, something flickered across his features, relief, maybe, or fear. "Don't try to sit up," he said quietly. "Thomas says you need to rest." Her throat was too dry for words. Silas seemed to understand, reaching for a glass of water on the bedside table. He held it to her lips with surprising gentleness, one hand supporting the back of her head. The water tasted strange, bitter with medicine, but she was too thirsty to care. "Clara!" He set the glass down, then did something unprecedented. He took her hand. His palm was warm, his grip careful, as if she might shatter. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Can you do that?" She managed the smallest of nods. You're not hysterical. You're not being dramatic. You're not imagining your symptoms. His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. Someone in this house has been poisoning you. Arsenic, Thomas says. Small doses over time, probably in your food or medicine. You've been telling the truth all along, and he stopped, jaw tightening. I didn't believe you. The word should have brought vindication. Instead, Clara felt only exhaustion and a strange, detached curiosity about who hated her enough to kill her. We don't know who yet, Silas continued. But we will. Thomas and I have a plan, but it requires your cooperation. We need everyone to think nothing has changed. That I still believe you're being dramatic, that Thomas is treating you for hysteria, that we're all going about our normal routines. His grip on her hand tightened fractionally. We need to bait the trap. And you're the bait. Clara tried to speak. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Bait. You'll be recovering from a nervous episode. Thomas will continue to visit, but publicly he'll be prescribing rest and tonics. In reality, he'll be administering antidotes and monitoring your system. I'll maintain my distance in public, but he paused, something painful crossing his face. In private, I'll tell you everything we discover. We'll work together to identify who's doing this. Why? The word took all her strength. Why are we doing this? Why believe me now? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because Thomas found arsenic in your blood. Because I carried you in from the snow and you felt like you weighed nothing. Because I've spent 6 months calling you a liar, and all that time you were being murdered. He looked directly at her then, and Clara saw something she'd never seen before in her husband's eyes: shame. I failed you. I won't compound that failure by being too proud to admit it. Clara wanted to tell him it was too late, that 6 months of cruelty couldn't be erased by one moment of belief. But she was too tired, and more importantly, she was too practical. She needed him. Needed his authority, his knowledge of the household, his ability to investigate without arousing suspicion. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when someone wanted her dead. What do I do? She whispered. Recover slowly. Accept Thomas's visits. Drink only what he gives you directly. Eat only food that Thomas or I have tested first. Silas's thumb moved across the back of her hand, unconscious and oddly comforting. And trust me. I know I haven't earned that. But Clara, I swear on everything I have, I will find who did this. And they will pay. There was something in his voice that reminded Clara why people feared the Duke of Blackwood. Something cold and implacable, like iron in winter. She'd been on the receiving end of his contempt for months. Now, finally, that razor focus would be turned on someone else. The Dowager, Clara managed. She brings my tonic. Every morning. Silas went very still. Are you certain? Never misses. Says it's for my delicate constitution. Christ. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. My father's sister. She's hated you from the start, but I thought it was just snobbery. If she's been, he turned back to Clara, his face hard. You will not drink anything she brings you. Is that clear? Clara nodded. Good. Silas returned to the bedside, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Sleep now. I'll have Thomas check on you in an hour. And Clara. He paused. I'm sorry. For all of it. I know that's inadequate, but it's true. She wanted to tell him sorry meant nothing if she died anyway. But the medicine was pulling her under again, and besides, there would be time for recriminations later. If she survived. As darkness claimed her, she felt Silas's hand still holding hers, warm and solid and completely unexpected. The Duke of Blackwood, keeping vigil over the wife he'd scorned. Better late than never, she supposed. Though it was a near thing. Before we go on, if this story has captured your interest, please like the video and subscribe for more. And do tell us in the comments where you are listening from today. Thomas arrived at Blackwood Manor the next morning with the brisk efficiency of a man on a mission. He examined Clara thoroughly, then spent an hour in the laboratory that had once been the manor's still room, testing every medicine, tonic, and powder that might have passed her lips in the past 3 months. Silas watched him work with the focused intensity of a predator. They'd agreed on their approach: to investigate quietly, maintain the facade, and wait for the poisoner to reveal themselves. But patience had never been Silas's strength, and every minute Clara remained vulnerable felt like an eternity. The morning tonic, Thomas said finally, holding up a brown glass bottle. The one Lady Thornbury brings her every day. It's absolutely saturated with arsenic trioxide. Enough in each dose to keep her systematically ill without killing her outright. How long has this been going on? Based on Clara's symptoms? I'd say 3 months, perhaps longer. Thomas set the bottle down carefully, as if it might explode. The Dowager has been murdering your wife in plain sight, and we all missed it because you'd convinced everyone she was prone to dramatics. The words were meant to hurt, and they did. Silas absorbed them without comment. He deserved worse. We need proof, he said instead. Evidence that will hold up under scrutiny. My aunt is a dowager countess. We can't simply accuse her without absolute certainty. Then we get certain. Thomas pulled out his pocket watch. Lady Thornbury will expect to deliver the tonic this morning. What if someone else delivers it instead? We watch her reaction. She'll know something's wrong. Exactly. And guilty people make mistakes when they're nervous. They enlisted Mrs. Pemberton first, calling the housekeeper to the study under the pretense of discussing household accounts. Silas watched her carefully as Thomas explained, in clinical detail, that the Duchess had been poisoned and they were investigating all members of the household. Mrs. Pemberton's reaction was immediate and unguarded. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widened with genuine horror. Poisoned? But how? Who would? She looked between them, comprehension dawning. You think it's someone in the house? We're exploring all possibilities, Silas said carefully. You've been with the family for 30 years, Margaret. You know everyone here. Who would want Clara dead? The housekeeper's face went through several emotions before settling on resignation. You want me to say it's Lady Thornbury? Because she's made no secret of despising the Duchess, has she? Calling her a dollar princess, saying she's corrupted the family line with common American blood. I want you to tell me the truth. Mrs. Pemberton straightened her spine. The truth is, Your Grace, that I haven't liked your wife. She's too informal, too loud, too American. But there's a difference between disliking someone and wanting them dead. Lady Thornbury, though, she hesitated. She's been different since your marriage. Obsessed with bloodlines and inheritance. She told me once that nature would correct the mistake given time. When did she say this? 3 months ago. Right before she started insisting on preparing the Duchess's morning tonic herself. Silas and Thomas exchanged glances. You're certain of the timing? I keep household records, Your Grace. I can show you. Next came Cousin Edmund, who arrived at the study with barely concealed irritation at being summoned. He was a slight man of 30, bitter at being displaced in the succession by Silas's unexpected marriage and heir-producing potential. Poisoning? Edmund's laugh was harsh. Well, that's certainly dramatic. Though I suppose it's the kind of thing an American would claim if she wanted attention. The arsenic in her blood would suggest otherwise, Thomas said coldly. Edmund went pale. You're serious? Entirely serious. Where were you 3 months ago when the poisoning began? 3 months ago. Edmund seemed genuinely confused. I was in London. I didn't return to Blackwood until last week. You can verify that with my club if you don't believe me. He was telling the truth, Silas realized. Edmund might resent Clara, but he'd been nowhere near the manor when the poisoning started. Which meant one suspect remained. Lady Thornbury, the Dowager Countess, swept into the study an hour later with the imperial bearing of someone who'd never been questioned in her life. She was 70 if she was a day, iron-grey hair perfectly coiffed, her black mourning dress immaculate despite being 5 years past her husband's death. Really, Silas, summoning me like a common servant. What could possibly be so urgent? Clara has been poisoned, Silas said without preamble. Arsenic. Administered over the course of 3 months. The Dowager's face didn't change. That was the first sign. A truly innocent person would have shown shock, confusion, denial. Lady Thornbury showed nothing but cool assessment. How unfortunate, she said finally. Though I suppose these things happen. American constitutions are so delicate. The poison was in her morning tonic, Thomas added. The one you insisted on preparing yourself. I was trying to help. The girl was clearly unwell. Because you were killing her. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Thornbury looked at each of them in turn, and slowly, terribly, she began to smile. Prove it, she said. Clara had been awake for most of the interrogations, her door left deliberately ajar so she could hear the proceedings from her bed. When Silas returned to her room after Lady Thornbury's departure, she was sitting up against her pillows, weak but determined. She's not going to confess, Clara said. No. Silas sank into the chair beside her bed. She's too clever for that. Without a confession or a witness, we have only circumstantial evidence. The arsenic in your tonic, her obsession with bloodlines, her access. None of it is enough to arrest a Dowager Countess. Then we make her confess. Clara's voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. Thomas's antidotes were working, slowly but surely. We give her another opportunity to finish what she started. And we catch her in the act. Absolutely not. Silas's response was immediate and firm. You're barely recovered. I won't use you as bait. You don't have a choice. Clara met his gaze steadily. She's not going to try again if she thinks you're watching. But if she believes I'm still vulnerable, still unguarded. Clara, listen to me. She leaned forward, ignoring the way it made her head spin. I've spent 6 months in this house being treated like a fool. Being dismissed and mocked and called hysterical. My own husband didn't believe me when I said I was dying. Well, I'm done being the helpless American princess. Her voice hardened. I want her caught. I want her punished. And I'm not going to hide in my room while you men decide what's best for me. Thomas, who'd been standing quietly by the window, let out a low whistle. She's got spine, Silas. I'll give her that. She's got more than spine. She's got a death wish. But Silas was looking at Clara differently now, seeing her perhaps for the first time. Not as an American interloper or a dramatic burden, but as a woman who'd survived weeks of systematic poisoning and still had enough fight left to demand justice. What are you proposing? He asked finally. Clara outlined her plan. The Blackwood ball was in 3 days. The Dowager would expect Clara to be too ill to attend, but what if she made a miraculous recovery? What if she appeared at the ball, weak but present, accepting drinks and food from various servants? The Dowager couldn't resist such an opportunity. She'd been patient for months. She wouldn't wait much longer now that suspicion had been raised. We'll be watching, Clara finished. You, Thomas, even Mrs. Pemberton if we can trust her. One of you will catch her in the act. And if we're wrong? Silas asked. If she tries something we haven't anticipated, then I'll be dead, which is what would have happened anyway if Thomas hadn't discovered the truth. Clara's smile was grim. At least this way, I go down fighting. Silas studied her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. You're extraordinary, did you know that? I married you for your money and treated you abominably, and here you are planning to risk your life to catch your would-be murderer. He paused. I don't deserve you. I never did. No, Clara agreed. You didn't. But we're past that now. The question is what you do next. I protect my wife. At any cost. There was something in the way he said it that made Clara's breath catch. This wasn't the cold, indifferent duke she'd married. This was something raw and honest and almost frightening in its intensity. Silas Vane had spent 6 months not caring whether she lived or died. Now, it seemed, he cared rather desperately about keeping her alive. Then let's catch a murderer, Clara said. The next 3 days were a carefully orchestrated performance. Clara appeared at meals, pale but improving. She accepted tonics from the Dowager with a smile, then quietly disposed of them later. She played the role of the recovered Duchess, grateful for her aunt by marriage concern, oblivious to the danger. And Lady Thornbury watched. Waited. Clara could feel the older woman's eyes on her at every moment, calculating, assessing. The Dowager had committed to murder. She wouldn't stop now just because circumstances had become complicated. On the evening of the Blackwood ball, Clara dressed in blue silk, her maid lacing her stays carefully to hide how much weight she'd lost. She looked like a ghost of herself, which was appropriate. She'd nearly become one. Ready? Silas asked from the doorway. He cut a striking figure in his evening dress, all sharp angles and aristocratic elegance. But there was something new in his eyes when he looked at her now. Something like respect. "Ready," Clara confirmed. "Then let's end this." They descended the stairs together, husband and wife, presenting a united front for the first time since their wedding. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and aristocratic pretension. The cream of British society gathered to celebrate nothing in particular and judge each other mercilessly. Somewhere in this crowd was a woman who tried to murder her. Clara smiled and accepted champagne from a passing servant, playing her part. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for their prey to spring it. The ballroom was stifling despite the winter cold outside. Clara made it through the first hour on sheer determination, smiling at the appropriate moments, making small talk with ladies who'd never bothered to learn her name. Silas stayed close, closer than he ever had at public events, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in a gesture that looked possessive but felt protective. Lady Thornbury circulated through the crowd with her usual imperial grace, accepting compliments on her gown, discussing the weather and the sorry state of modern manners. She seemed entirely at ease. But Clara noticed the way the dowager's eyes followed her, noting every glass she accepted, every plate of food, every moment she was alone. "She's waiting for an opportunity," Thomas murmured, appearing at Clara's elbow with the practiced timing of a society doctor. "Stay in sight of either Silas or myself at all times." Clara nodded, but the room was beginning to spin slightly. The antidotes were working, but recovery was slow, and she'd been on her feet for too long. She needed to rest. Just for a moment. "I need some air," she told Silas quietly. "The terrace." "I'll come with you." "You'll cause talk." "I'll be fine." 5 minutes. She could see him weighing it, the conflict between maintaining appearances and keeping her safe. Finally, he nodded. 5 minutes. "Then I'm coming to find you." The terrace was blessedly empty and cold. Clara leaned against the stone balustrade, breathing in air that didn't smell of perfume and candle wax and barely concealed contempt. From here, she could see the frozen garden stretching toward the woods, skeletal and beautiful in the moonlight. Footsteps behind her. Clara turned, expecting Silas or Thomas. It was Lady Thornbury. "My dear," the dowager said warmly, "you really shouldn't be out here alone. You're still recovering." I needed air. The ballroom was too warm. Of course, of course. Lady Thornbury moved closer, her black silk dress rustling. In her hand, she carried a small crystal glass of something dark. "I brought you some of the tonic. You missed your evening dose." Clara's blood turned to ice. They were alone. The terrace doors had closed behind the dowager, cutting off the sound of the ballroom. No one knew they were here. She'd made a mistake. "That's very kind of you," Clara managed, keeping her voice steady. "But I'm feeling much better. I don't think I need." "I insist." The warmth in Lady Thornbury's voice had turned to steel. "After all, we want to make certain you stay healthy. Don't we?" The dowager closed the distance between them with surprising speed. Clara tried to back away, but the balustrade pressed against her spine. "Trapped." "You should have died quietly," Lady Thornbury said conversationally. The American girl who couldn't adapt to English winters. Such a tragedy. But no, you had to be resilient. Had to keep fighting. Had to make Thomas suspicious. She raised the glass toward Clara's face. This is concentrated. You'll drink it, or I'll force it down your throat and claim you threw yourself from the terrace in a fit of hysteria. Either way, you'll be dead before morning. Clara's fingers scrabbled for purchase on the stone behind her. The drop to the gardens below was 30 feet at least. Even if she could climb over the balustrade, she'd never survive the fall in her weakened state. Why? Clara whispered. Because this is England. We have standards. Bloodlines. You're polluting everything with your American commonness. Silas would have married properly if you hadn't bought your way in with railroad money. Lady Thornbury's face twisted with contempt. I've spent my entire life protecting this family's reputation. I won't let it be destroyed by a dollar princess. She lunged forward with the glass. Clara twisted sideways, felt the cold liquid splash against her shoulder instead of her face. The smell of almonds, sickly sweet. Arsenic. Help! Clara's scream cut through the night. Somebody. Lady Thornbury's hand clamped over her mouth. Stupid girl. No one can hear you over the orchestra. But someone had heard. The terrace doors burst open and Silas appeared, Thomas right behind him. They must have been waiting, watching. Clara felt relief flood through her even as Lady Thornbury's grip tightened, turning desperate. Let her go, Aunt. Silas's voice was glacial. It's over. Over? It's not over until she's dead. The dowager was screaming now, all pretense of dignity abandoned. She still held the empty glass, held it like a weapon. You were supposed to marry properly. You were supposed to. Silas crossed the terrace in 3 strides and wrenched his aunt away from Clara. The force of it sent Lady Thornbury stumbling backward. She caught herself on the balustrade, the glass shattering on the stone. Thomas, get Clara inside. Now. But Clara couldn't move. Her legs had given out. She watched from the ground as Silas stood over his aunt, fury and disgust warring on his aristocratic features. You tried to murder my wife, he said quietly. You tried to murder her, and you almost succeeded because I was too proud and too stupid to believe her. But I believe her now, Aunt. And so will everyone else. Behind them, the terrace had filled with guests drawn by the commotion. Half of British high society stood watching as the Dowager Countess of Blackwood crumbled before them, her hand still stained with the arsenic she'd tried to force down Clara's throat. She's lying. Lady Thornbury shrieked. The American is lying. She's hysterical. She's dying. Thomas's voice cut through the chaos with clinical precision. Because you've been poisoning her for 3 months. I have the evidence. The bottles. The medical records. Your own words, overheard by 3 witnesses just now. It's over, Lady Thornbury. You've lost. The Dowager collapsed then, all the steel going out of her spine. She sank to the terrace stones and wept, ugly tears of rage and frustration rather than remorse. Clara watched it all from where she sat, Thomas's coat wrapped around her shoulders, Silas's hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. The trap had worked. They'd caught their murderer. She'd survived after all. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Ladies fainted. Gentlemen shouted for the constable. The orchestra had stopped playing, leaving only the sound of shocked whispers spreading like wildfire through the assembled aristocracy. The Dowager Countess of Blackwood, arrested for attempted murder in front of the cream of British society. The scandal would echo for decades. Silas handled it with the cold efficiency that had made him feared in parliamentary circles. He summoned the local magistrate, ordered Lady Thornbury confined to the library under guard, and faced down the whispered questions with aristocratic disdain. Yes, his wife had been poisoned. Yes, his aunt was responsible. No, he would not be discussing family matters with people whose primary interest was gossip. Clara watched it all from a chair in the corner, Thomas hovering nearby with his medical bag, monitoring her pulse and muttering about shock and exhaustion. She should have felt triumphant. The woman who tried to kill her was caught. The truth was revealed. Justice would be served. Instead, she felt only bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, hollow grief for the life she'd imagined when she'd agreed to marry a duke. She'd known it would be a business arrangement, but she'd hoped for something more than this. More than murder and scandal and a husband who'd learned to care for her only when she was dying. Clara! Silas appeared before her, his face pale beneath his careful composure. The magistrate needs your statement. Are you well enough to speak with him? Yes. She let Thomas help her stand, grateful for his steady hand. Let's finish this. The interview was mercifully brief. The magistrate, a ruddy-faced man who clearly wished he were anywhere else, took notes as Clara recounted the months of illness, the tonics, Lady Thornbury's obsession with bloodlines. Thomas provided the medical evidence. Silas corroborated everything with the cold precision of a man stating facts rather than discussing his family's disgrace. "And you, Your Grace," the magistrate said carefully, "you had no suspicions? For 3 months, your aunt was poisoning your wife, and you noticed nothing." The question hung in the air like a blade. Silas's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "I noticed my wife was ill. I chose not to believe her. That failure nearly cost Clara her life, and it is something I will have to live with for the rest of mine." He looked at the magistrate directly. "But my aunt's crime is not diminished by my mistakes, and I expect her to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, regardless of her title or her relationship to this family." The magistrate nodded slowly. "Lady Thornbury will be held pending trial. Given the severity of the charges and the evidence against her, I expect she'll be convicted. The sentence for attempted murder." "I know the sentence." Silas's voice was flat. "Do what needs to be done." After the magistrate left, Silas ordered the ballroom cleared. The guests departed in a flurry of scandalized whispers, already mentally composing the letters they would write, the gossip they would spread. The Duke of Blackwood's American bride, poisoned by his own aunt. The Dowager arrested at a ball. It was the kind of scandal that would fuel society gossip for years. Clara didn't care. She was too tired to care. "Come." Silas offered her his arm. "Let me take you to your room." They walked through the empty corridors of Blackwood Manor in silence, past portraits of vain ancestors who stared down with aristocratic judgment. Clara wondered what they would think of the family now. The bloodline Lady Thornbury had been so desperate to protect, tainted by murder and disgrace. At her door, Silas paused. "I need to say something, and I need you to listen." not as my wife, but as someone I've wronged terribly. Clara waited. I treated you with cruelty and contempt from the moment we married. I told myself it was honesty, that I was being forthright about the nature of our arrangement. But it was just cowardice dressed up as principle. He met her eyes, and she saw genuine pain in his face. You were alone in a foreign country, in a house that hated you, and I made it worse. My coldness gave my aunt the cover she needed to try to kill you. And even when you were dying, I called you a liar. Silas, let me finish. His voice cracked slightly. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that if you choose to leave, to return to America and file for divorce, I won't contest it. I'll provide for you financially, of course. You'll have everything you're entitled to and more. You paid enough for the mistake of marrying me. Clara studied him in the dim corridor light. The Duke of Blackwood, offering to release her from the marriage he'd been so cold about maintaining. 6 months ago, she would have leaped at the chance. Now, it was more complicated. What if I don't want to leave? She asked quietly. Silas looked stunned. Clara, after everything, I know who you really are. Not the cruel Duke who dismissed me, but the man who carried me in from the snow. The man who sat vigil at my bedside. The man who faced down his own aunt to protect me. She paused. We made vows, Silas. In sickness and in health. We've certainly tested the sickness part. Maybe it's time to try the health. You would stay? Knowing what I did? Knowing I nearly let you die. You made a mistake. A terrible one. But you're trying to make it right. Clara reached out and took his hand. I didn't marry you expecting a love match. I knew what this was. But maybe it could become something more. If we're both willing to try. Silas stared at their joined hands as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. When he looked up, his eyes were suspiciously bright. I don't deserve you, he said hoarsely. But if you're offering me a chance to try to be worthy of you, I'll take it. Then try. Clara squeezed his hand. Starting tomorrow. Tonight, I need to sleep for approximately 3 days. He laughed, a surprised, genuine sound that transformed his face. Tomorrow, then. And Clara. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. Thank you. For being brave enough to give me another chance. As she closed her bedroom door behind her, Clara reflected that she'd come to England expecting a title and a cold marriage of convenience. She'd gotten poisoning, scandal, and a husband who was learning to care. It wasn't what she'd planned. But somehow, impossibly, it might turn out to be better. Spring came to Blackwood Manor 3 months later, though by then, Clara and Silas were preparing to leave it. The trial had been swift and brutal. Lady Thornbury was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The scandal had been enormous, but the Vanes had weathered it together, presenting a united front against the gossiping masses. More importantly, they'd begun to build something real from the ashes of their hollow marriage. Clara stood in the conservatory, watching the gardeners pack her American rose bushes for the journey across the Atlantic. Silas had insisted on bringing them, along with half the manor's library and a frankly ridiculous number of her belongings. He'd taken her statement about starting fresh seriously. "Are you certain about this?" Silas asked from the doorway. He'd asked variations of this question at least once a day for the past month. Selling Blackwood, moving to New York. It's a drastic change. Clara turned to face him. He looked different now, lighter somehow. The cold aristocratic mask had cracked, revealing someone warmer underneath. Someone she was beginning to genuinely love. I'm certain. This house nearly killed me. I'm not interested in living in a mausoleum. She crossed to him, taking his hands. Besides, you promised me an adventure. I'm holding you to that. An adventure. His mouth quirked. I'm not sure I know how to be adventurous. Then you'll learn. The same way you're learning to be a proper husband. And how am I doing on that front? Clara pretended to consider. Better. Though you still have a tendency toward brooding in your study when you're worried instead of just talking to me. I'm working on that. I know you are. She kissed him, still marveling at how natural it had become. 6 months ago, the thought of kissing Silas Vane would have been laughable. Now, it was the best part of her day. The journey to New York took 3 weeks by steamer. Silas spent most of it reading American newspapers and fretting about business prospects, while Clara sketched plans for the townhouse they'd purchased sight unseen on Fifth Avenue. Thomas had agreed to join them, claiming he was tired of English weather and British aristocratic nonsense. I'm giving up my title, Silas announced one evening as they stood at the ship's railing, watching the sun set over the Atlantic. Clara nearly dropped her sketch pad. You're what? My title? Duke of Blackwood. It's tied to an estate I no longer own and a family reputation that's been destroyed. In America, I'll just be Silas Vane. No, Your Grace. No aristocratic pretension. He looked at her seriously. Is that acceptable? Acceptable? Silas, it's your choice. I married you when you were a duke. I'll stay married to you when you're not. I know. But I wanted to ask. This is supposed to be a partnership now. Equal partnership? Clara smiled and leaned into his shoulder. Equal partnership? I like the sound of that. New York welcomed them with noise and energy that made London seem like a graveyard by comparison. Clara's family threw a party to celebrate their return. The daughter who'd married a duke and returned with a devoted husband who'd given up his title for her. It wasn't quite true, but Clara didn't bother correcting the narrative. Let them think it was romantic rather than complicated. The townhouse on Fifth Avenue was perfect. Large enough to be impressive, small enough to feel like home. Silas hired American staff who didn't care about British aristocratic pretension, and Clara filled the rooms with light and color and furniture that didn't look like it belonged in a museum. On their first anniversary, they hosted a dinner party. Nothing formal, just friends and family gathered around a table that actually encouraged conversation. Thomas regaled them with stories of his new medical practice. Clara's brothers teased Silas about becoming American. Someone played piano badly but enthusiastically. Later, after everyone had left, Clara and Silas stood in their drawing room surveying the cheerful chaos of discarded glasses and flower arrangements. This is nothing like Blackwood, Silas observed. No. Is that a problem? He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. It's perfect. You're perfect. This life we're building is perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I refuse to be dismissed. Yes. That's what makes you perfect. He kissed her forehead. A year ago, I was the Duke of Blackwood, cold and miserable in a haunted manor, married to a woman I didn't deserve and didn't appreciate. Now I'm just Silas, living in New York, married to the most extraordinary person I've ever met. He paused. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for being worth the second chance. Clara smiled up at him. Though next time I complain about being ill, you're going to believe me immediately, right? Immediately. I'll probably summon 3 doctors and have every item you consume tested for poison, just to be safe. Good. I've developed a healthy fear of tonics and dowager countesses. They laughed, and it felt like victory. They'd survived poison and scandal and a loveless marriage. They'd crossed an ocean and built something new from the ruins of what came before. The Duke of Blackwood had thought his wife was pretending, until the doctor whispered the truth. But the truth had set them both free. Outside, New York hummed with possibility. Inside, in a townhouse on Fifth Avenue, 2 people who'd started as strangers were finally learning what it meant to be partners. It was, Clara thought as Silas led her upstairs to bed, a much better ending than the one Lady Thornbury had planned for her. And it was only the beginning. If you found comfort or meaning in this tale, a simple like or subscription is greatly appreciated. And if you wish, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel.